On behalf of IMC Chamber of Commerce and Industry, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all at the seminar on navigating global air freight scenario, challenges, trends, and solutions organized by the IMC Logistics and Transportation Committee. A very warm welcome to Mr. Glenn Hughes, Director General, the International Air Cargo Association, for sparing his valuable time and being with us today. The global air cargo industry is experiencing steady growth, driven by rising demand for faster transportation solutions. Air cargo volumes are projected to reach 62 million tons in the year 2025, reflecting the sector's critical role in global trade. The growth is fueled by increasing reliance on e-commerce and the need for efficient supply chain operations. Despite challenges such as capacity constraints and the geopolitical tensions, air freight traffic continues to expand, showcasing the industry's resilience. Several industry segments are propelling the expansion of air freight. E-commerce continues to be the major driver online. Uh, Retailers relying heavily on air cargo to meet consumer expectations for fast delivery. The pharmaceuticals and healthcare sectors also play a crucial role, requiring temperature control logistics solutions for transportation of sensitive goods. Additionally, the automotive and electronics industries contribute significantly, leveraging air freight for rapid movement of high value components. The general air freight market benefits from the increasing demand of specialized cargo services, perishable goods such as fresh produce and seafood, relying on air freight for timely delivering to the global markets. High value goods, including luxury items and technology products, further drive demand for secure and efficient air cargo solutions. These segments underscore the versatility of air freight industry and its ability to adapt to diverse market needs. The global air freight industry in 2024 reflects a delicate balance between challenges and resilience. The technological advancements such as artificial intelligence and automation are transforming operations and driving efficiency. E-commerce continues to fuel demand while sustainability emerges as a critical priority. Uh, Stakeholders must embrace agility and innovation to adapt to market shifts and disruptions. By prioritizing collaboration and investing in digitalization, the industry can unlock new opportunities. The path forward demands a commitment to operational excellence and environmental responsibility, ensuring long-term growth and relevance in an evolving global landscape. I am confident that today's seminar will help delegates to get expert insights into global air freight scenario, focusing on air freight trends, challenges, and impacting their business and other practical solutions to enhance operational efficiency and resilience. I would like to thank IMC's Logistics and Transportation Committee, especially Dr. Pramod Sant, Chairman, and Mr. Keshav Tanna, co-chairman of the committee, to organize this event. Before I conclude, a few words about IMC. Established in 1907 and having its headquarters in Mumbai, the IMC Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the IMC, is the apex chamber of commerce, trade, and industry in the Western region, with its membership base of over 5,000 members and over 150 trade associations affiliated to it. Together, it represents and advocates interests of over 400,000 businesses and industry establishments across the country from diverse sectors of industry. I once again welcome everyone. I also request all of you to register for the Bharat Calling conference on February 27th, which will really have a congruence of all international business houses. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sunita Ramnathkarji, Vice President, Indian IMC Chamber of Commerce. So we have heard the Vice President giving insight of the air freight industry. So without, there are only few things which I wanted to add is the air cargo, which carries the air freight is the 35% of the value of the entire business which happens with that. So it is so important for the global trade to happen. The more than 6 trillion of worth good get transferred, you will get use the air freight. And the air freight is growing at the rate of 10% plus year on year. So which is very interesting. And definitely being a user of one of the important user of air freight industry, this topic is very close to my heart. And thanks Glenn for accepting our invite to speak here. Now I request Keshav Tannaji, who is a co-chair of our committee, to introduce Glenn and take the webinar forward. Over to you, Keshavji.
Thank you, Sunita ji. Thank you, Dr. Sun. And good evening, friends. Most of my Airfreight colleagues on this program would not really require any official introduction to Mr. Glyn Hughes. However, to briefly say a few words about him, Glyn has been involved with air cargo for the past 40 odd years. He started his career with British Caledonian and thereafter joined the International Air Transport Association, or IATA as most of us know it, in the year 1991. During his long association with IATA, Glyn went on to become the global head of cargo in the year 2014. I have had many an interaction with him since then, and though we both sat on opposite sides of the table, both of us respected the fact that we were looking after the best interest of our respective communities. His was the airlines, whereas mine was the forwarders. Glyn has come a long way since then, and in the year 2021, he took up the position of Director General of the International Air Cargo Association, namely TIACA. Being an expert in the air cargo field, he would speak to us today on the global air cargo scenario, its trends and challenges for 2025, and some possible solutions. There shall be a short Q&A session post Glyn's presentation, and I encourage all of you to post your questions on the Q&A chat box, from where I shall address the same to Mr. Hughes on your behalf. I now request Mr. Hughes to go ahead with his presentation, and over to you, Glyn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, first of all, Madam Ramnathkar, Dr. Pramod, and Mr. Keshav, for your very kind introductions there, very comprehensive introductions, and for your invitation for me to speak to your auspicious organization and membership today. It's a great pleasure. What I would like to address during the presentation is really a few areas. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes introducing TIACA. Then I'd like to give a little bit of an air cargo market overview, looking at some of the trends. Sadly, we do also have to focus on turbulence. Air cargo, of course, is in the air. That means we will face some form of turbulence. Sadly, most of the turbulence we face is on the ground and in halls of political institutions, but we still have to address them. I think it's also always important to address what the industry is doing to support sustainability. And then lastly, I will just focus on some of the key advocacy positions that we actually adopt. So a little bit about TIACA. TIACA is, as has been mentioned by Mr. Keshav, the International Air Cargo Association. We actually say it's a horizontal association. Most people are familiar with vertical, such as IATA, which represents airline interests, ACI, which represents airport interests, etc. Whereas TIACA, we represent the industry from a global perspective. So our membership is drawn from this whole list here. I'm not going to read the whole list, but it's basically anybody that's involved in air cargo is always welcome to join TIACA. The value of that means that when we meet with governments and meet with different institutions, we speak on behalf of an industry. We don't speak on behalf of a sector presenting a perhaps single aspect view. We have a vision. Our vision is very straightforward, is that we would like to see a safe, profitable and united air cargo industry. We do recognize that we have to focus much more on embracing modern technology and practices, sustainability practices. And of course, we also recognize, and I think as Dr. Pramod had mentioned initially, the role that this industry plays in supporting the global economy. I'm not going to go into these in detail other than to say that TIACA, it's not a big association. There is, in fact, just 4 of us, but 3 based in Miami and I'm based in Switzerland, allowing me to connect more with the world. But what we try and do is the key one here is we try and focus on partnerships where we can actually embrace other organizations around the world and use and aggregate their knowledge together with our membership knowledge and others. We can hopefully feed back and to help the industry move forward. We are spending a lot of time now on outreach, trying to, again, educate those that need to be educated, mostly in the political arena. And again, I'll touch upon a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. So now if I talk a little bit about the air cargo market overview. As had already been mentioned, the value, in fact, Dr. Pramod, I'm happy to say that the number has gone up from the 6 trillion that you focused on to say that air cargo now actually moves around $8 trillion. Oh, I have to build the slide first. There we go. So I like to use this slide in particular. I'm talking to government ministers because I usually start by congratulating ministers, usually ministers of transport, in how they have actually captured huge value for the global economy from tourism. And you see the value here that in 2024, the value of global tourism by air and by sea and by road, this is international tourism, was $1.4 trillion. And it's always fascinating to see ministers congratulate themselves. Oh, we generated $1.4 trillion. And then I say in air cargo, we only moved 1% of global trade by value, but it generated nearly 6 times more in value for the global economy than the total value of international tourism. And I say this, and I say this as often as I can, because ministers sadly don't always reflect on the value that aviation, or in fact, I'm going to use logistics and trade in general, the value that logistics and trade can bring to supporting national prosperity, growth, and increases. And this is something which no other industry can impact the global society and global community as much as what your members produce and which your members move around the world. Again, I think we should all be proud of the fact that you bring jobs, you bring growth, you bring prosperity, you bring livelihoods to people who otherwise would perhaps not have the same opportunities. So I think international trade and whatever we can do as an association to enhance and ensure it's protected and in fact increases is really probably our largest single aspect that we focus on. Now, apologies, the next few slides will be a little bit complicated in terms of charts and numbers, but there is a story that I'd like to progress here. First of all, if we were doing this presentation last year, so if we were at the beginning of 2024, and if I was looking back at 2023, I would do so with a very sad face, because 2023, we saw the increase in supply of aircraft coming back onto the networks, wide-body freighters being introduced, the passenger networks continuing to grow post-COVID. So cargo capacity was significantly growing, as you see in the part on the right-hand side, between 6 and 15% throughout the whole year. Yet sadly, demand was very depressed. We started 2023 with negative demand, and in fact, it was only really the month of November and December of 23 did we start to see demand picking up. But it was a very disappointing and very depressing year. But we're not January 24, we're actually January 25. So now I look back at last year and I say, wow, have fortunes changed? As had been mentioned in the opening remarks, we saw double-digit growth for every single month last year. It's unheard of in this industry to actually see double-digit growth. And coupled with the fact that the capacity increase was actually on the way down. There was been a slowdown because of supply chains in the production of new aircraft. Passenger airlines have introduced practically their full capacity network back to pre-COVID levels. And there was a slowdown in production of freighters. So we saw significantly rising demand and relatively low levels of supply increases. So a complete reversal. So how did that then translate into load factors and the rate scenario? Again, these two charts reflect the position of 23 had we been talking about this last year. And I would have said the dynamic load factor, and that is really our slightly more sophisticated way of saying aircraft utilization. It takes into account volumetric cargo as well as actual gross weight cargo. So it's more the total capacity available and the total usage. So we saw dynamic load factors throughout 2023, again, depressed versus the year prior. So when you have low levels of demand, high levels of supply, low load factors and decreasing load factors, the rate scenario was significantly down. So the industry was really struggling up until the end of 2023. Now we look at what's happened in the last 12 months. We've seen load factors rising practically. In fact, it was throughout the entire 2024, we saw load factors rise. There is obviously a dwell when you start to see load factors rise, capacity is being utilized more and more. So the freight scenario had reversed, and we did actually start to see freight rates turning around last year and actually going up. Now I'm going to come back to this scenario and say, okay, so we know 2024 was a very good year for the industry, but what can we expect from 2025? First of all, we have to look at, well, why was 24 such a good year? What was it that happened in November of 23 that really turned things around? And we can actually pinpoint one factor. It was the Red Sea crisis. It was basically whatever it was, that X percentage of international trade that went through the Suez Canal had to extend shipping routes up to 14 days extra from Asia to Europe, adding significant cost, adding significant reduction in global capacity, because the maritime sector, if you have ships sailing for 14 extra days, that means it took out the equivalent of about 8% of global capacity. More interestingly, because of surcharges and because of the increase in fuel that was now being burnt to actually have those longer sailing times, the price of the maritime cargo rose dramatically. And this chart illustrates that there is a significant correlation between complexity and cost increases in maritime and the fortunes in air cargo. We don't see ourselves as a competing mode of transport. We're actually complementary. There would be no air cargo if there was no successful maritime sector, because manufacturers, as we've mentioned before, 1% of cargo volumes go by air. The vast majority go by maritime. So we need the both to work complementary. But we do have periods of time where some cargo will shift between the various modes. And when it does then create perhaps challenges on capacity and challenges on the demand side. So now we actually saw the trigger point. And initially there was quite a bit of cargo that needed to move urgently. Has been mentioned earlier, I think, by Madam Ramnathkar in her opening remarks. The pharmaceutical sector is so crucial, and it's so crucial from an Indian export perspective. And what was sad, and I don't know how much it was reported in Indian press, but in Europe, we go back to December and January, there was a shortage of almost every drug type in Europe that was coming from Asia. There were treatment programs where people were saying, I'm sorry, we have no more supply chains, because they were reliant on steady supply chains of ships coming through. But with that 14 extra days and with the lack of capacity, then it turned out they had the lack of storage container or shipping containers, which meant that there were some significant shortages of drugs, life-saving drugs in Europe. Now, that had been addressed immediately as much as possible with chartering of aircraft. But aircraft aren't just sitting on the ground waiting to be called upon. So one theme that I'm going to be talking about regularly going through is what got us through that crisis, what got us through the COVID crisis, and what's going to get this industry through every crisis going forward is the relationship between the shipper, the forwarder, and the carrier. It is so crucial. Where the communication is open, free, transparent, and timely, then you can actually get the good results. where shippers communicate with their forwarders about forward planning needs for capacity. The forwarder can then actively seek out that capacity when it's needed and where it's needed. I think this industry needs to collaborate more now than at any point we've had in the future. Oh, sorry, in the past. One last chart, which I'd like to refer to as well, and this is something that the organization that we use for data called Zenita has a lot of information that it tracks. The dynamic load factor here, and I'm actually just going to highlight the load factors coming out of Asia Pacific. And this is really reflected. This was really taken at the middle of last year, but it hadn't changed throughout the year. When you get above about 80–85%, that's basically full. So what we're saying here is that the demand has already been mentioned for e-commerce coming out of Asia Pacific, out of Hong Kong. And can you imagine Hong Kong having up to 150 freighters a day moving e-commerce out of Hong Kong? Staggering. It's staggering to see, and it's staggering to think we're still not there yet. It's still growing. E-commerce is still launching, the major e-commerce players are still launching in new markets. So the load factors coming out of Asia Pacific were practically full, and yet the aircraft on the way back were less than half. So this again illustrates one of the biggest challenges we have of air cargo is the fact that it's unidirectional demand. So if you look at Middle East and Central Asia to Asia Pacific, load factor of 35%. From Europe to Asia Pacific, 45%, and from North America, 44%, which means that airlines having to get creative to try and get the aircraft back as much as possible. And the reason why I mention this in particular context to India is as India's economic growth continues, and I still believe of all the major economies, your projected GDP growth is still significantly greater than second place China. Even if its revision is up, it's still not going to touch that of India, that additional demand or capacity might need to start routing through India much more to go east, west, south, north, in all directions. The belly capacity that's coming to the Indian market is great, but as the cargo tonnage that you're manufacturing increases significantly, I think more access to main deck freighter capacity will be a challenge going forward. So coming back then to talking about what can we expect this year, obviously, and I will talk a little bit later on about what's happening in the US and where everybody is really focused on trade policies that's going to be dictated by US actions. But I'll cover that separately. We are still expecting key trade lanes to be continuing to be very full, very busy. E-commerce is showing no let-ups of easing off. Every time I see my children, they're like my research projects. I just see parcel after parcel after parcel by their front door. And what's fascinating is they are actually generating business twice. My daughter, if she wants one pair of shoes, will order 4. So that you can guarantee 3/4 of whatever she orders, you're also getting to move on the way back. So, it's the young people which are driving that. Or so I thought. Then when I see my wife, I say, is that for the children? She said, no, those are my packages. So e-commerce doesn't recognize it. It's not restricted to gender, to age, to geography. It's a global phenomenon. The next aspect we to look at for next year is aircraft utilization, running at almost record levels, which again shows the system is relatively stressed. There's not a lot more that can be, wrung out in terms of operational hours from the major freighter aircraft. And then the last part on the right-hand side, which is what about redeliveries? This is conversions or new capacity that's going to be added this year. Even if we assume no aircraft are retired, the increase in capacity is only 4.4% for this year. The estimates for growth for the industry can be somewhere between 4 and 8%. So if you've got growth of 4 and 8%, and yet without any retirements of aircraft, only an increase of 4% of capacity, it shows we could be in for another tight year going forward. We also have to recognize that there are aircraft that will be retired. FedEx and UPS, who operated between them about 100 MD-11s over the last few years, have been progressively retiring these. A number of 747-400s approaching 30 to 35 years old now. They will probably need to be retired, some old 76s. So there is an expected increase in retirements depending on what happens, the price of fuel. The fuel is the key consideration for the older aircraft in terms of their fuel efficiency for operational effectiveness. So again, it could be a tight year, more again, focusing on the need for further collaboration. I like to just go through a couple of really nice aspects of this, and apologies, I'm preaching to the converted, you all know this, but these are just slides that I use. Again, it'll be illustrated a little bit later on in terms of the political arena. When we get challenged about, well, we don't need to fly things around the world, our response is, well, when there are humanitarian crises, it's the networks of those global aviation operations that are premised on commercial needs that allow us to be the first responders to humanitarian disasters. And air cargo has over the years saved millions and millions of lives because of the commercial access to quick aircraft or quick activity or capacity to get into a marketplace. But this industry doesn't just save lives when there is actually humanitarian disasters. Thanks to all of the wonderful developments, particularly in India, and I think, again, congratulations should be given where it is due. The number of lives that the Indian vaccination production industry, plus as all the other life-saving drugs, it's in the millions every single year, and we don't really announce that or pronounce that as often as we should do. There are parts of this world that wouldn't have vaccination programs, and I'm going to say Latin America and Africa, if it weren't for the air cargo industry, because the vaccines that are produced, quite often, they don't have long shelf life. They need to be controlled in temperature-sensitive environments, and it's through the collective activities that millions of people's lives can be protected every year. Again, I think it's something that we should be proud about of this industry. We also do our part to protect wildlife. There are some amazing innovations where animals are actually taken to help conservation and breeding programs and releasing into the wild. Again, this can only happen because of the commercial networks that your members actively support and promote. So we're very pleased about that. We also know that the air cargo industry has supported the evolution of fashion. And India and Southeast Asia in particular, and the Indian subcontinent have benefited from the focus on faster fashion and ultra fast fashion, again premised on air cargo going forward. And this one I find an interesting discussion is that on Mother's Day, I think it was May 12th last year, there were 90 countries in the world that celebrated Mother's Day. Aggregate households was in excess of 400 million households received flowers, enhanced the lives of everybody involved because of flowers that pretty much came from 4 countries, Kenya and Ethiopia in Africa, and Colombia and Ecuador in Latin America. And the production of those flowers, the movement of those flowers grown under fresh natural conditions, supported tens of millions of livelihoods and brightened the lives of hundreds of millions, if not billions, around the world. And again, I mention this because some groups challenge and say, well, we should not be flying flowers into Europe, for example. For Valentine's Day, which is coming up actually in a few weeks, and other occasions during winter, to grow flowers in Europe, you would need to have artificially heated greenhouses. You'd need to use chemical fertilizers and pesticides. You would actually destroy the ecosystem there, or you would put it at risk. And you'd also put tens of millions of lives at risk in parts of the world who can grow these under natural conditions. So we have to look at sustainable solutions and responsible solutions that actually play a part in the global society as well. So I think, again, this industry does a fantastic job of supporting all of those situations. Going through now into some of the air cargo trends. One of the areas, and I can't encourage people enough to go through and dig out, just go through the website when you have a free moment and Google DHL. They do a wonderful annually updated report looking at social and business trends, technology trends, and then the impact that they will have on the various logistics industries. And I think it's an excellent indicator of the areas that we really need to be looking out for. And I've kind of just summarized some of those there. Digital transformation and automation is something that we need to embrace much more as an industry to be able to move the projected increase in volumes in an optimized fashion. As had already been mentioned during the introductory remarks, e-commerce growth, currently around 20% of global tonnage is e-commerce. That is expected to grow to potentially to 40+%. Now, if you consider how many hundreds of freighters I've said today are dedicated to e-commerce, what does that mean for the other customers if we have another doubling or a doubling of current e-commerce demand? Which means we need to again make sure that there is an increase in the cargo capacity. So we need to work to make sure that the airlines and the other operators have the right amount of capacity to support the industry. We know sustainability and green logistics is important for, and forgive me, I have to refer to the fact that it's a lower priority to the new US administration, but it is a continuing high priority, I believe, for the rest of the world. So it is something that we need to focus on going forward because it's about making sure that the planet is protected for our children, our children's children, and successive generations. So it is an important factor going forward. Supply chain resilience and risk management. Again, and I will focus a little bit later, as we can anticipate changes in trade patterns, perhaps China +1 production strategy, if the threatened tariffs of 60% go on goods coming from China, production will move. Production will move to other places that actually can get through to the destination markets without the same obstacles that perhaps China production will manage. So I think we can expect going forward some agility needed because production will need to be multi-centered. China today accounts for about 26% of global production. No one country can absorb even a quarter of that. So, it's not a case of India picking it up everything or Vietnam or Malaysia. It's a case of everybody's going to specialize and pick up parts. We've already seen quite a bit of growth in cell phone production, etc., and Foxcom's factories that are coming to India, and I think that is expected to continue through. So I think we can actually also see regulatory changes, the compliance situation become more complex. Last mile delivery innovations. This again is something as people want more specialized services, data analytics, cold chain logistics, customer-centric logistics, as well as infrastructure development. And then I look at all these and I think, no wonder I've lost my hair if you look at the challenges this industry is facing. But I also say, and I make no, I make no apologies for this, the role of the freight forwarder is more important today than it has ever been in the history of this industry. And I say that with knowledge of my good friend Keshev and the role that he plays and other members here. And I think going forward, just managing the complexities of the regulatory changing situation, which is almost daily. We mentioned e-commerce, and I think we should also just focus on the fact that this is the first time we've ever seen something in this industry that impacts every region. In the past, we saw the growth of pharmaceuticals. Great, you can highlight 5 or 6 countries that benefit from pharmaceutical production. High tech, 5 or 6 countries that benefit from high tech. But e-commerce is growing everywhere because everybody produces something that everybody wants. And because of the individuals, that it really is the criteria for where e-commerce can grow is ability to access the platforms. Well, thanks to the internet, everybody can access platforms, access capacity. Again, accessing that capacity is because of global networks. So it's really a very bright opportunity for the whole world. When you look at the number of parcels that has generated, the volumes are just phenomenal. In 2022, 170 billion parcels projected to rise 50% in the next couple of years. I think that could even go much further because if you look at how Temu and Shein are progressively their growth is 15, 20%, and they still haven't opened up every market. Then there are some new innovations, also new evolutions. Look at the people that are expanding consumer base. This is something we don't really focus on. But if you look at last year, over 100 million people were added to the consumption class. That's the equivalent of the population of Great Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Portugal. It's like doubling, introducing those countries and making them all consumers every year. Phenomenal. India added more consumers than the entire population of Belgium, Netherlands, and Switzerland. And those consumers, most of them are young, most of them are technically connected. And I think this is again where we need to focus on that the consumer base, as it grows, the demand for goods will grow. We can also see an evolution in the rise of social e-commerce. And this again is something that is phenomenal to watch. And I now have to make an apology. In fact, it's not an apology. It's a shameful plug as a proud father. This image is of my daughter. She has a very large social media profile and presence. This is old. She's got more than 530,000 followers now on one platform, and it's about nearly 1 million across all her different platforms. When she does a video, if she promotes a particular product, it can generate up to 10,000 sales of that product to people all over the world. I mean, it's phenomenal to watch. And I think that, and she's actually just a very, very minor player in this, that when you have some of these people who have 150 million followers, if they just come on and saying, you know, do you like the t-shirt I'm wearing? Well, here's where you can find it. Click on here and you can order it online. I mean, and if you can think about how easy that is, and the next slide, you know, really illustrates this, 57% of all purchases for e-commerce are on the smartphones, which means every single person on this call, on this webinar, everywhere we go, on every bus, every train, every part of public transport, walking, etc., they're walking with the world's largest shopping mall in their pocket that's open 24 hours a day. I mean, it's scary when you think about that. But it's also, we're in the right industry, you know. So from that side of things, I wouldn't want to necessarily be a landlord of real estate property that's built very expensive shopping malls with very high rents. But I would love to be involved in this particular sector. So I think, again, it bodes very well going forward. Sorry for the very complex slide here, but this is something that IATA put together, which is looking at the various different models that exist on e-commerce. And it's phenomenal. And I'm not going to draw any conclusions because some have their own capacity, some use freight forwarders, some use hybrid models. But what's fascinating about this is this chart was done, I think it was 2018. And what I find most fascinating is the world's two largest e-commerce platforms weren't even on this chart. They're not here. There's no Temu and there's no Shein. And today they account for nearly $40 billion, in fact, probably more than $40 billion of online sales. And yet they came up from nowhere, which tells us tomorrow will be somebody that's not here today. So again, we have to be agile. And I think it's very exciting to watch going forward. The other evolution that's really changed in e-commerce is the fact that originally there was really, you know, the first few days was Singles Day, which is in 11th of November, which is mostly a Chinese phenomenon. Then there was Black Friday and Cyber Monday. Now there are shopping events almost every day of the year. So, you know, e-commerce, thankfully for this industry, it wasn't just peak at the end of the year, it's now throughout the year. So it's a constant steady stream of demand, which is also why we don't necessarily see the traditional peaks in March and October like we used to, because there are pretty much periods of high demand throughout the entire year. Now, I did say that we would be addressing some turbulence. And sadly, I think that's going to come from several areas. We've already seen the US talk about the potential increase of tariffs. Now, the sad thing about tariffs is they're not one way. Anytime a country introduces protectionist measures, there will be retaliatory measures, which then sadly does put an obstacle in front of the global economic growth prospects. The US has a very high de minimis level. It's $800 per day today, which means this is an area that the US government has focused on. And you can see where they're targeting when the actual name of the legislation that has been proposed, and this is in the top right, was the End China De Minimis Abuse Act. I think they're being very obvious in who they're targeting, in where they see the problem, but they're actually looking at it from the other way. It's actually not China abusing the de minimis, it's actually the US consumer taking advantage of a freely available global environment to purchase goods from overseas. But sadly, I think we can expect to see some challenges happening in that particular area. We were very pleased to see in the last few days, the Houthis have said that they will end the Red Sea attacks. They said they will still continue to focus on Israeli ships. And they have also said that US and UK ships would also come into attack if US and UK weapons were used against any of the Palestinians, if there is, and Hamas, if there is a resumption of the challenges there. I think we're all very carefully watching what will happen in the next few weeks as the ceasefire hopefully holds, but the anticipation is that there will be perhaps a resumption of hostilities. So the shipping lines, some of them are saying they will resume, some of them are saying they can't actually resume because they've already got the ships that are actually going the longer sailing that are coming into Europe. If they send the next round of ships through the Suez Canal, they'll actually then have blockages at European ports because they can't receive twice the amount of ships coming in at the same time. So that's what I'm saying. I've put it here as turbulence because we don't really know what's going to happen. It could also end up that if the hostilities, let's hope the hostilities do end and that full resumption of the maritime usage of the Red Sea and the canal can go back to normal, we could then see overcapacity in the maritime sector because they did purchase and introduce new ships expecting this period of longer sailing to take place. So we don't know what's going to happen with that. We don't know what's going to happen with US tariffs that they have threatened to put on to the EU as a bloc. One in particular is Trump is very concerned. He said that we buy a lot of Mercedes, BMWs, Audis, and VWs. They don't buy very many of our Chryslers or our, and I see Keshev smiling. I'm thinking, a lot of the Ford F-150, the largest or the highest selling car in the US, doesn't really fit in European roads. So, but Trump says, look, we're buying too many of their cars. They're not buying enough of our cars. So we're going to stick on tariffs. So we don't really know what's going to happen. We also saw he's mentioned about retaking the Panama Canal. Now, we know that that's not just a straightforward process. That would be a military situation. But if whatever happens, that could end up with, again, putting another blockage on international trade if certain flag-carrying ships were not able to use the Panama Canal. If, for example, he overturned the treaties, which gave it back to the Panamanians, it could restrict ships coming through from China to US East Coast. We don't know. These are things we need to watch as an industry. Now, again, turbulence, the rise of China +1, I think that's a huge opportunity, but I think there's also risks because, as we've said, if production needs to be fragmented or diversified across a number of different manufacturing sites, it does put challenges on how to get the capacity for that production through to different parts of the world. We also know the US just last week introduced a new proposed rule which will look at, I mentioned the de minimis, which means things coming into the US under $800, you don't have to pay duties and VAT, you don't have to make a filing. Because the US is concerned particularly about fentanyl coming in through e-commerce shipments, the new rulemaking will suggest that every consignment, whether or not it's duty payable or not, should be filed. That would be an extra 1.2 billion filings that the industry would have to make and would have to pay for. That's a huge cost that the industry would have to burden themselves with. I've also put a reference to Indian GST. I'm been fascinating to read the challenges and I see Keshev again, it's not a fun subject. It's sadly a huge burden on the forwarding community, particularly if Indian exports go, and it's quite often it's a payment up front for reclaiming later on. But I did read sadly that a number of smaller freight forwarders have not been able to actually cover the cash flow demands that this actually has caused. The problem that will generate is that you do need to have the most economically viable supply chain, particularly as Indian production grows. So I know that there are various associations, ACI, ACFI, a number of other associations in India raising this with the government. And I mention it because I think it's true in every country that we need to look at how we can actually not create artificial blockages within each country that holds back growth and logistical expertise. Lastly, on the turbulence, we're also facing things like challenges on safety. As we have a lot of proliferation of e-commerce platforms, we need to make sure that we educate everybody on the need to ship in full compliance of safety demands and safety regulations. We also are constantly aware, and I mentioned at the very beginning, there are organizations who are saying, and this is one called Stand.Earth, that air freight cargo is a threat to climate progress and public health. I've spoken with these people and I've asked them how they respond to as I've covered in this presentation, that it's only through commercial air cargo networks can we save 2 million children's lives a year, and we can save tens of millions when an earthquake stuff happened, for example, in Syria and Turkey. They have no response for that. They basically say, oh, no, we want you to use the aircraft to move the vaccines around as you did for COVID. We want you to use the aircraft to protect the children in Latin America. And I said, but we can't have these networks purely waiting for those days. That's not viable. So we do need, as I mentioned before, to educate, but also from ourselves have a responsibility, responsible actions. I know time is going to get short, so I'm going to run through the next section very quickly. I mentioned industry sustainability. I'm not sure if you want to make the slides available. If somebody wanted to look at this detail, I'm happy to do so. We don't look at sustainability as an industry just on the environmental impact. It's one important part, how we look at decarbonization, waste, and protecting biodiversity. But we also need to look at it from a society and cultural perspective about making sure that we as an industry are a great place to work. We can attract the next best of the next generation. We need to support communities, improve lives and well-being, etc. And I think that these are translated into a lot of projects. I'm going to go through this bit very quickly. We do an annual survey where we actually ask the global community their thoughts on how the industry and how they've moved in terms of a sustainability aspect the prior year. Again, that's just large number of respondents. This is the only one I'll focus on, which is why is sustainability important? And if you look at the reasons why it's important, important for customers, important for employees, important for business partners, important for the local community, regulators, shareholders, financiers. It's becoming so important for so many people involved in this industry and associated this industry. It's why a lot of organizations are focusing on it. Again, I will go through quickly. A lot of organizations have strategies in place, which is great. A lot of them are focusing on energy consumption reduction, fleet modernization, the use of sustainable aviation fuel. Apologies for going through quickly. I want to make sure that you guys have plenty of time for your closing questions, etc. A lot of investment has been made on fleet modernization within the forwarding community, within the ground handling community, within the airport community. Everybody's focused on how we can actually work towards a net zero 2050 target, if not earlier. Digitalization and innovation are obviously very important aspects of that as well, across the industry, as well as making sure that we continue to invest in people. It's so crucial. An interesting fact, and forgive me for this, I'm involved in a group that's looking at aviation from a global employment perspective. Globally, just looking at pilots, less than 5%, I think it's about 4% of global pilots are female around the world. When you consider that about 50% of young women that come out of university with engineering, with engineering degrees, 50% male, 50% women, mathematics degrees, 50% male, 50% female, but having less than 5% of global pilots being women, with the exception being India, it leads the world by a significant percentage. I believe it's up to about 13%. And the second place country is around 6%. It's about double second place. Tremendous success in India, again, because of the focus on academic prowess and the freedoms and liberties and opportunities that are actually created. Again, I don't think we do enough to focus on where good things are happening. So we always say, well done, India, for leading the way, as you do with many things nowadays. And my very last slide, which I literally will just say, it's because it's really a combination of everything I've said before. As TIACA, this is really where we try to make a difference by advocating for key industry positions. And with that, I think I say thank you very much, and hope I hope I can't see how many people. I hope everybody's not switched off, Keshav, but thank you very much again for the opportunity.
Now I can assure you, Glenn, that we are all online, and thank you for that very deep insight on things, on how things were and how things are to come. You mentioned double-digit growth last year. Yes, that was very welcome. And it was very encouraging. This year has started a bit sluggish. Of course, it's just started 2021 days, but it surely started sluggish. Geopolitical tensions, Red Sea wars. I mean, these are things which are unavoidable. I mean, and we have to find ways around it. You mentioned tariffs. Yeah, that's another suspense question, so to speak. Nobody knows which way the world will go, with one of the largest economies having a change in leadership. E-commerce, we know this one since a few years now, that's been leading the air cargo industry. I didn't know it was 150 freighters freighters a day moving out of Hong Kong. So that's quite a bit. I don't know how we'll deal with the challenge of an 8% increase in air cargo with a 4.4% increase in capacity possibly. So in terms of capacity, there's going to be a crunch, which will of course have pressure on the rates going ahead. Good, bad, ugly, I don't know, because obviously shippers are not going to like that too much. But you mentioned rightly collaboration. So if the shippers are going to be able to collaborate more closely with the forwarding community in terms of planning their shipments, in terms of planning their space, I think going ahead we would be able to address the rate challenge which we were dealing with with great difficulty last year. In terms of challenges for the freight forwarder, I've never regretted being a freight forwarder, by the way, but challenges in terms of GST, I mean, I don't know what to say, but anyway, I guess that's a very local issue, and we have to deal with it the best way we can. So as an association, as a chamber as well, also, we are trying to address it for our members as to how we could find some relief for our members going ahead. Sustainability, I wherever I've been, I think I'm hearing that some of the major airlines are trying to attain a net zero carbon by 2050, carbon emissions by the year 2050. I don't know really if it's really achievable or which way it's headed, but it's important, yes, because even as forwarders today, when I'm asked to quote in a tender, I have a column which I need to fill up, and that is how much carbon there is a formula which we need to work out and say how this shipment is going to affect the environment. And even if I have the same rate as somebody else, if I have a lower carbon emission in that column, I get the shipment. So it's going in that direction for sure. Forwarders may like it, not like it, but in days to come, time will tell. We have some questions. Sorry, I won't prolong it too much, but so one of the questions is, how is TIATA interfacing with shipping and importing community to better understand customers' needs to lead innovation and change in supply of logistics and services?
That's a great question. We do have shipper members. We work very closely with the European Shippers Council, for example, and a shipper association based in the US. So we would always love to have more. We engaged with the Hong Kong Shippers Association as well. We also work with individual shippers. We try and speak at shipper events where they're put on so we can actually get the voice of the shipper directly. TIACA does have a shipper, we call it a cluster, but it's more like a subgroup comprised purely of shippers. They published a white paper a few years ago now. I do have to admit that we need to update it because the world has moved significantly. So probably over the next 12 months, we will be looking at updating the shipper white paper that we published to position. We also work very closely on the pharmaceutical side with Pharma.aero, which has a number of pharmaceutical manufacturers and shippers in their membership. So we try and engage as much as possible, but I'm always happy to engage more. So if any of your members have some opinion, here is well, my email address. I'm happy for you to share that. If anybody wanted to send an email with their thoughts, we do need to capture much more of the shipper voice to translate that into what we do as an association and hopefully guide the industry going forward. It's so important.
Thank you. We shall be sharing your email ID because I'm sure there will be questions which they could then follow up on a one-to-one through the chamber, of course. The next one, I think you've already perhaps in a way answered is, are aircraft manufacturers and airports keeping pace with innovations and change? I think in terms of aircraft manufacturers, you did mention that we are looking at a 4.4% increase in capacity, whereas the trade is going to grow at 8%. But would you like to answer it in any other way as far as airports go? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to say that airports around the world in the last few years have become innovation hubs. They're much more active. And just look at India. You know, if you go to any Indian trade show, for example, any Indian conference, the forwarder and the airport are all very, very vocal about innovation and moving forward, which I think is great. And I'm pleased to see it much more balanced than, let's say, 20 years ago when it was just the airline view. It was the airline view, and that kind of dictated the way things go. The forwarder is the man that, or the woman that is closest to the shipper. So therefore, they're in the best position to kind of project the future trends. The airports are the hub of where things go through. But that is on the positive side. On the negative side, that's not true everywhere. In Africa, 55 countries, 1.3 billion people. There are only 3 airports with cool chain infrastructure in place, capable of handling some of the more sensitive pharmaceuticals, for example, coming in. So this is a huge risk, is that we actually end up with two-tier infrastructure. We've got world-class infrastructure in India and other parts of the world, but sadly still very antique-based or very old infrastructure in some others. So I think a lot of innovation is happening, but it's not consistent everywhere.
I'm going to take 2 last questions and combine it into one. Obviously, this is from a forwarder. So how can airlines be made more accountable for the lapses in delivery of services? And the other one, which goes along with that, is I think they've put on the IATA hat on your head just now. So airlines are not giving due importance to claims filed by customers, and a long time is taken to settle them. What steps can be taken? So this is a bit, I think, from your old hat, if you could.
Yes.
You know.
Well, actually, I think the answer to both of those is technology. I think if you think about the accountability of service, quite often nowadays, and if you look at claims, the first thing that happens with a claim is, well, it wasn't me that did the damage. That wasn't me. You have to speak to somebody else. And it's almost impossible to find a party that will say, oops, sorry, it was me. But now, with the advent of tracking technology, with milestone reporting, with data sensors that are going into a lot of the pharmaceutical shipments, you know, it's actually taking some of the guesswork out of this. If you've got a high value consignment of pharmaceuticals that went out of safe temperature range, it can record exactly the time when it went out of, you know, if it can only be stored at 2 to 8 and it was at 15 degrees for an hour and a half, and it was at 11:33 p.m. on the 12th of January, then all you need to know is this timestamps. Oh, well, the cargo was in whose custody at that time? Great. Here is the data. It's irrefutable. So I would say that technological advances will actually help us all be more accountable for everything we do in life. You know, good driving. Nowadays, a lot of insurance companies insist that there are data loggers on cars for young people, because that's the highest percentage of accidents and indiscretions in terms of speeding fines. So I think advances in technology will help people be accountable for the services they perform, and it should speed up the actual claims process if things go wrong.
Thank you. I think there are a few more, but in the interest of time, Dr. Sant, should we end the session with a vote of thanks, or is there anything else you would have in mind to?
No, only thing is that there is a one issue on GST. So maybe you can just inform what as a chamber we are trying to do. There is one question on the GST 18%. So I think Glenn will not reply, but I think if you could give that insight, what are we doing on the GST part?
So to the member who has asked that question, yes, the chamber as well as 3 major associations have already taken this issue up with the concerned ministry. We are trying to take it up through the chamber itself, because the chamber in itself holds quite a bit of authority, and we will keep members informed. So it's not a subject which is forgotten or frozen. We are addressing it, and we would get back to you hopefully with some good results, and please await the same. With that, if I think I have the privilege of also thanking Glenn with a vote of thanks, because it's only due that he spent so much time with us. And in the interest of keeping time, I know you're not a Swiss, but you are in Switzerland. So we make sure that we end it on time. We all are already about a few minutes late, but it is my privilege to propose this vote of thanks for this insightful seminar. I would like to express my sincere thanks to you, and thank you for readily responding to our request despite your busy schedule. The air cargo industry stands at the forefront of growth opportunities driven by the increasing demand for fast and reliable shipping solutions. E-commerce continues to fuel this expansion as businesses rely on air freight to meet tight delivery schedules and transport of high-value goods. The sector has become indispensable in global supply chains, ensuring business continuity and customer satisfaction. Technological advancements present significant opportunities for innovations which not only improve operational efficiency but also strengthen customer trust in air freight services. In today's seminar, I'm sure Mr. Yu's thought-provoking address enlightened us all. I would like to thank IMC's Logistics Transportation Committee, especially Dr. Pramod Sant, Chairman of the committee, for organizing this insightful seminar. As co-chair, I must thank all the participants for being with us today. Your presence has been a source of encouragement to the IMC. Thank you, Glenn, for gracing this occasion. And until next time, I would like to say thank you to all of you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.